A carriage lost in the snow, a woman left for dead, and a man who had buried his past beneath a silence colder than any winter. When Lydia Marlowe fled the whispers of Boston society, she thought she was escaping shame. But what awaited her in the northern wilderness was not solitude. It was a man with eyes like frost and hands that no longer believed they could heal. Thaddeus Quinn had vowed never to let another soul inside his cabin, or his heart, until one avalanche unearthed not only a stranger, but a reckoning. Tonight a single fire must warm two broken lives. And not every storm is made of snow. Tell us, where are you listening from? And what do you love most about historical romances? The cold had a voice that morning. It whispered against the frost-bitten windows of the carriage, crept through the seams of wool cloaks and gloves, and settled heavy and still over the endless pines of the northern wilderness. Lydia Marlowe sat upright on the hard bench of the coach, her gloved fingers tightly clasped around the worn strap of her leather satchel. Every bone in her body ached with exhaustion, but her eyes, grey-blue and clear as the winter sky, remained wide open, refusing to close, refusing to rest. She had not looked back as Boston disappeared behind her, its brick walls and judgmental gazes swallowed by the morning fog. There had been no tears. Lydia had long since taught herself not to cry where others might see. The news of her broken engagement had spread through parlors and prayer circles like fire through dry parchment. She had not begged, she had not pleaded. She had simply packed her remedies, her tinctures, and the name her mother gave her and boarded the coach north. Her cloak of deep moss-green wool lined in flannel was drawn tightly across her chest. Beneath it, her homespun dress of charcoal grey clung to her frame, its hem stiff with the slush of previous stops. Snow fell like ash across the glass panes, and the wheels creaked, groaning beneath the growing weight of ice and silence. The coachman had said nothing for miles. The other passengers had disembarked hours before, each bound for farmsteads or trading posts scattered through the forest. Lydia was the last. And then, without warning, the world roared. A thunderous crack shattered the hush of the trees. The horses screamed. Snow surged down the mountain in a blinding torrent of white. Lydia had no time to think, only to brace, but the carriage lurched, tipped and rolled. Wood splintered, glass shattered. Then, darkness. She did not remember the fall. Only the sensation of weight pressing upon her, snow filling her mouth, her nose, the space between thoughts. Cold, brutal, and infinite. And then, nothing. Thaddeus Quinn had not meant to go that far beyond the ridge. He preferred to keep to his lines, to the neat, hard-cut paths he had carved from the forest, with his axe and his silence. But something in the air that morning was wrong. The kind of wrong a man learns to feel in his bones when he has spent more winters alone than among others. The scent of pine was sharper, the weight of the clouds heavier, and in the distance a sound like a dying animal, followed by stillness too perfect to trust. It was then he saw the wreck. Half buried beneath the snow, the coach was little more than shattered wood and twisted iron. One horse lay still beneath a mound of ice, the other had vanished, and in the snow, barely visible, an arm, small, gloved, unmoving. Thaddeus approached slowly, his boots crunching through the frost, his breath thick in the air. He crouched low and brushed the snow aside with thick, calloused hands. A woman, unconscious, pale, her face smudged with blood, her braid frozen against her cheek. She did not stir when he lifted her. She weighed so little, it frightened him. The storm was fast and merciless. By the time he reached the cabin, the wind had risen into a howl, and the snow fell like knives. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, carrying her over the threshold with a grimace, and laid her down upon the fur-lined cot by the fire. For a long moment, Thaddeus did not move. He stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by the scent of melting ice and ash, staring at the woman who had fallen, quite literally, into his world. Her lips were blue, her skin ghost pale. He cursed under his breath and lit another log. He removed her boots, her gloves, hesitated before unclasping the cloak that had frozen to her shoulders. Underneath, she wore a modest dress, fine fabric now caked with ice, the seams strained by cold. He covered her with every woolen blanket he owned and placed his largest kettle over the fire. "Don't die," he muttered aloud, surprised by the sound of his own voice. "Not here, not with me." She did not answer, but her hand twitched beneath the blankets. "Dee." And when Lydia opened her eyes, the world had changed. The air was warm, heavy with wood smoke. The ceiling above her was low and rough-hewn, the beams thick with age. A fire cracked in the stone hearth to her right, and the scent of pine and something boiling filled the room. Her body ached in places she could not name. She tried to sit, but pain lashed through her ribs. Then she saw him. He stood with his back to her, pouring water from a kettle into a basin. Tall, broad, wrapped in a heavy coat the color of slate, his hair tied loosely at the nape of his neck, dark and threaded with grey. His posture was rigid, controlled. When he turned to face her, his eyes, a shade of hazel so deep they seemed carved from bark, met hers. Neither of them spoke. For one breathless moment, the cabin held only their gaze. Then Thaddeus Quinn placed the basin on the table and spoke with a voice roughened by disuse. "You'll live, but the road is gone. The storm buried it." Lydia blinked. Her lips parted, cracked and dry. "Where am I?" "My cabin," he said, turning away. "Half a day from the wreck. The coach is lost. There's no one else." Her heart pounded. The silence returned, thick and pressing. And there, in that space between survival and understanding, two strangers began a winter they had not chosen. A winter neither would forget. The snow did not fall that week. It settled. It cloaked the world with the steady rhythm of something ancient, quiet, and absolute. Each dawn brought a deeper hush, as if the forest itself had forgotten how to breathe. The pines stood burdened, hunched under ivory weight. The narrow path that led to the stream disappeared entirely, and the sky became a blanket of grey, pressing down on the roof of the world. Within this silence, the cabin endured. Inside, time passed in slow, deliberate hours. There were no clocks, no bells, no church chimes to mark the days. Only firelight, flickering against stone and timber, only breath and movement, and the long, soft scrape of cloth against wood as Lydia Marlowe crossed the room. Her recovery had been quiet, like everything else here. The fever had receded, the bruises faded to gold and plum. Still, her body ached in the morning and trembled slightly by nightfall. She had not spoken much, not because she feared him, but because she sensed deeply and without question that her voice was not yet welcome. She had learned, in the manner of women who survive, how to read the air in a room, and the air around Thaddeus Quinn was heavy with silence. He moved through his days with a kind of practiced precision. At dawn, he chopped wood. At midday, he skinned game or mended tools. In the evening, he cooked. Simple fare, nothing more than what the land allowed. He cleaned the rifle with reverence and checked the traps without complaint. He never raised his voice, but he did not offer it freely either. He spoke only when necessity demanded. "You need water. Don't touch the blade. Eat before it cools." There were no questions, no pleasantries, no introductions. And yet, Lydia had never been more seen. She watched him in quiet moments from the corner of the room or across the table, noting the lines that grief had etched into his face. His hands were broad and square, capable of splintering wood or sewing leather with the same calm efficiency. His hair, dark, streaked faintly with silver, was always tied back, but never tightly. And his eyes, those still pools of hazel, held stories he refused to tell, but stories had a way of slipping through the cracks. One afternoon, as the wind howled like a beast beyond the shutters, Lydia reached for a quilt folded neatly in a cedar chest. It was meant to be simple warmth, nothing more. But as she opened the lid, her hand brushed against something soft and faded, a child's blanket stitched with tiny red birds. She paused, breath catching in her throat, as if she'd uncovered a secret that had never meant to be found. She closed the chest carefully. Later that night she saw him sit, briefly, in the second chair by the fire, the one he never used. He did not remain there long. Just long enough for memory to touch him, just long enough to make her wonder. Lydia spoke for the first time that week, 3 nights later, when the kettle boiled over and hissed against the coals. The sound startled her. Her fingers reached for the handle, but it was Thaddeus who moved first, crossing the room in 2 strides. He caught the pot before she did, his hand brushing hers. Their eyes met. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice low, unsure. He did not speak, but he did not let go of the pot immediately either. His hand lingered, rough and calloused, pressing lightly against hers as if weighing her presence. "No harm done," he replied, and his voice, low, sanded with years, carried something unexpected: warmth. After that night, the silence between them shifted, not vanished but softened, like ice beginning to thin beneath the light of longer days. They still spoke rarely, but when they did, it was without fear. Lydia, who had once recited Latin names for tinctures with clinical pride, now offered her words gently, like gifts. She told him of the apothecary in Boston where she'd trained, of the old Irish woman who taught her to read symptoms in a man's breath, not just in his skin. She spoke of her mother's garden, of basil and balm, and the way violets always bloomed late near the stone wall. He listened. Thaddeus spoke little of himself, but in fragments, she learned. That he had once served in the army, that he had left it, that he had lived in this cabin for many winters, and that the scars on his knuckles were older than the war. One morning, she saw him watching her as she hung damp cloths by the fire. He did not look away when their eyes met. He nodded once and returned to his work, but something in his gaze lingered, an unspoken acknowledgement. She was no longer a guest. She was no longer a burden. She was simply here. Still, there were boundaries. She learned not to touch the drawer in the back room. She never asked about the locket she saw him hold one night when he thought her asleep. She did not press when he stepped outside during storms, standing still as stone with his coat drawn tight, facing the wind like a man seeking punishment or peace. There was a rhythm between them now, quiet, unhurried. She mended the torn sleeves of his coat without asking. He left her the last piece of bread without comment. Their hands brushed often, while passing plates, while stirring stew, while reaching for the same branch of firewood. Each touch, brief and restrained, burned more than words could name. The snow outside deepened. It climbed the windowsills and covered the woodpile, pressing against the glass like a ghost wanting in. But inside, the cabin breathed. One night, as the fire dimmed and the wind sang its cruel lullaby, Lydia stood near the hearth, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She gazed into the flames, her thoughts lost in the movement of light across stone. Behind her, Thaddeus sat at the table, sharpening a blade with practiced ease. The scrape of steel against stone paused. "You're not afraid of the silence," he said. She turned to him, surprised by the suddenness of his voice, the weight behind it. "No," she replied. "I'm afraid of words spoken carelessly, of people who speak only to fill the air." He considered that. "I'm not good with words," he admitted. "Haven't been it for some time." "You don't need many," she said, "only the right ones." Their eyes met again, this time without flinching. Outside, the snow fell soundlessly, but inside the cabin, something shifted. The wall between them, built of memory and loss, began, imperceptibly, to crack. And through that fragile crack, something unnamed began to stir. Something not yet ready to bloom, but bold enough to breathe. The wind had quieted, but the silence remained. That strange, suspended kind of stillness that follows after days of snow and confinement. Outside, the forest seemed to hold its breath beneath a sky the color of wet wool. The icicles no longer whispered. They hung like sharp teeth from the eaves, unmoving. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, casting long, quiet shadows that stretched across the walls like forgotten thoughts. Thaddeus had left before dawn, wrapped in his greatcoat, boots thick with frost, rifle slung over his shoulder. He said he would return by dusk, heading east toward the ridge where his snares had been laid 2 days prior. Lydia had stood by the door as he disappeared into the trees, her arms crossed beneath her cloak, her expression unreadable in the pale morning light. She was alone now, for the first time in days. The cabin, once oppressive, now felt vast. Every creak of the wood, every snap of the hearth echoed louder in his absence. She moved slowly through the room, tidying the space as she always did, placing the herbs in order, shaking out the linens, stirring the ash in the stove. Yet something in the air tugged at her senses. It was not curiosity, it was instinct. That strange pull she had followed her whole life, the same one that had taught her to find pain before it was spoken aloud. Near the back wall, beneath the edge of the cot, she noticed it. A single floorboard, slightly raised, not broken, not damaged, but warped ever so subtly from years of being pressed and then left alone. She knelt, her knees on the rough-hewn floor, and pressed her fingers into the narrow space between the boards. It gave with a soft groan. Her heart began to race. What lay beneath was not much. A small wooden box, worn and plain, tucked beneath the floor like something forgotten or hidden. She hesitated, her breath shallow, but her fingers moved on their own, lifting the lid. Inside, a collection of letters bound with twine now frayed and dulled with time. A miniature portrait encased in a delicate silver frame, and most heartbreakingly, a pair of tiny leather boots, worn at the soles, scuffed at the toes, no larger than her palm. Lydia sat back on her heels, the box in her lap. The room blurred at the edges. The portrait revealed a woman, young, perhaps 20, with chestnut hair swept into a soft chignon, her expression solemn but not unhappy. Her gown was modest, her eyes downturned, yet there was something fragile in the way her mouth curved, as if she had once smiled often and then forgotten how. The letters were addressed in a handwriting she did not recognize, faded ink, formal script. One bore the date, October 1811. She touched nothing else. The boots, cradled in the corner of the box, seemed to hum with a silence louder than any storm. It was the kind of silence that belonged to a name never spoken aloud, a life that had ended before it had learned to run. Lydia's hands trembled as she replaced the items and lowered the box back into its place. She closed the floorboard and stood slowly, her breath caught somewhere between guilt and sorrow. She had not meant to trespass, but she had found something that now lived inside her. When the door creaked open at dusk and Thaddeus stepped inside, snow melting from his shoulders, he paused mid-step. Lydia was by the fire, standing still, her back to him. He knew. "What did you see?" he asked, voice low and strained. She turned to face him slowly. "Nothing I had a right to," she answered. His jaw tensed. He dropped the bundle of pelts onto the table with a thud. The sound snapped the air between them. "You went through my things," he said, not shouting. His voice was never loud, but thick with something darker. "You had no reason." "No," she replied softly. "Only a feeling." He stepped closer, his boots echoing across the floor. "Did you read them?" he asked. "No," she said. "I didn't have to." He exhaled sharply, as if trying to hold back a tide rising too fast. "You don't understand what those things are." "Then explain them to me," she said, her voice catching. "Let me understand." But he turned away, his shoulders rigid, his back now a wall between them. "There are things in this place that have been buried for a reason," he said, barely audible. "You have no idea what silence costs. You come from a world of words, of chatter and lace and talk. I buried mine long before you walked into this cabin." She stared at him for a long moment, her hands clenched at her sides. "Then why didn't you burn them?" she whispered. "If they cause you pain, why keep them?" The fire crackled. A log split with a pop. Thaddeus's hands trembled slightly as he unfastened the buttons of his coat. His fingers, always so steady, faltered, and that's when she saw it. A deep gash along the side of his palm, bleeding through the cloth. "You're hurt," she said. "It's nothing," he replied. But she was already moving. Her basket of linen and salves sat near the table. She took a clean cloth, dipped it into the warm basin, and crossed the room with purpose. "Sit," she said. He didn't move. "Please." The word, spoken barely above breath, seemed to stop the storm in its tracks. He sat. She knelt beside him, her shawl sliding from her shoulders. Gently, with hands trained in care, she took his injured hand in hers. The gash was clean but deep, likely from a rusted snare. She cleaned it without speaking, her fingers brushing against the edge of his wrist, steady and sure. He did not look at her, but he did not pull away. When she applied the salve, lavender and comfrey, his hand twitched in hers, not from pain, but something else, something buried deeper than flesh. She wrapped the cloth tightly, her breath brushing against his knuckles. Her fingers lingered just a second too long. "It will scar," she said finally. He looked down at her. "So many things do," he murmured. Their eyes met, and for the first time the silence between them was not made of walls, but of bridges, of the ache that follows restraint, of the nearness that trembles just before surrender. She did not ask him again about the box, and he did not thank her with words, but when she rose to leave, he reached out and touched the edge of her sleeve, just briefly. It was enough. Outside, the night deepened. Snow fell again, but softer now, less like a burial, more like a memory. And somewhere beneath the floor, the secret stayed quiet, but not forgotten. The wind had become a constant, almost familiar companion. It wailed and whispered beyond the cabin walls, like some ancient ghost that refused to be silenced. The trees, blanketed in snow, groaned under the weight of ice, their branches bending like supplicants in prayer. The path to the stream was now a frozen corridor of white, and the sun, when it deigned to appear, offered more light than warmth. Inside, however, the stillness had begun to shift. It began with small things, a shared glance that lingered longer than it should, the sound of laughter, soft, surprised, and quickly swallowed, that escaped Lydia's lips when Thaddeus made a dry remark about the stubbornness of squirrels, a second chair that was no longer untouched by his presence, a second cup of tea that he now poured without asking. Each act was slight, almost invisible, but to Lydia they felt like drops of rain falling on a roof, long dried by drought. On the third morning of the new week, she stepped outside with a hatchet in her hand and determination in her spine. The air bit at her cheeks, but she welcomed the sting. Thaddeus had mentioned, almost in passing, that she might learn to chop kindling properly, so she had taken it upon herself to try. She stood before the pile of logs, her boots sinking slightly in the snow, her breath a visible cloud in the crisp air. She lifted the blade and struck. It bounced off the wood. Inside the cabin, Thaddeus leaned against the door frame, watching. "You're aiming like you want to frighten it, not split it," he said, voice amused but calm. She turned, brushing hair from her cheek with her gloved wrist. "I'm trying." "I can tell," he said, stepping outside and taking the hatchet from her. "Come here." She moved closer. Not too close, just enough for him to gesture toward the log. "Grip it lower. Let your arms do the work, not your shoulders." She obeyed. He stepped behind her, only inches away, his hand grazing her wrist as he guided her grip. The scent of pine and smoke clung to his coat. Lydia's breath caught, not from the cold this time, but from the sudden awareness of him. Solid, real, near. "Now," he said, his voice lower, rougher. "Aim with intention." She brought the hatchet down. This time, it split the log cleanly in two. She turned to him, a smile threatening the corners of her lips. "There, you've got it," he said, stepping back. The smile bloomed fully then, radiant in the pale light. He looked at her as if he hadn't seen her smile before, and perhaps in truth he hadn't. Not like that. By midday the fire crackled warmly, and the scent of thyme and stew filled the air. Lydia moved about the cabin with ease now, her fingers nimble and sure as she ground dried roots into powder and poured warm broth into a clay bowl. Thaddeus sat at the table, cleaning a length of twine and whittling wood for traps, but his eyes often drifted toward her, as if some part of him couldn't look away for long. That night they shared dinner in near silence, broken only by the occasional question, the clink of a spoon against a bowl, the creak of the old wooden bench. But it was not an uncomfortable quiet. It was the kind that held peace, the kind that allowed breathing without fear. Lydia had begun keeping her remedies in a row near the fire. She made space for them carefully, asking no permission, but always watching his face for disapproval. None came. "You dream loudly," she said gently one evening, when he woke with a jolt and a muffled cry. He sat upright on the cot, sweat glistening at his brow, his breath ragged. He did not speak. She rose, wrapped in her shawl, and moved to the small table where she kept her oils. Without a word, she poured a few drops of valerian and lavender into a cup of water and offered it to him. He took it, drank. His hand trembled slightly as he handed it back. She sat near him but not beside him. "You don't have to tell me," she said, "but you don't have to bear it alone either." His eyes found hers in the dim light. Something flickered there, not trust, not yet, but a hesitation yielding to possibility. Days passed. The storm outside howled, but inside the fire grew. And then came the fire that neither expected. It was near dusk, the sky a deep slate, the snow falling softly like powdered silk. Lydia bent near the hearth, adjusting the kettle, when the hem of her skirt brushed too close to the flame. It caught, first a flicker, then a sudden surge. She gasped, stumbling back, trying to beat at the flames with her hands. But Thaddeus moved before thought. He lunged across the room, wrapping her in his coat, pressing her against him, his hands rough and swift as he smothered the fire with his body. The flames hissed and died. Lydia clung to him, breathless, shaken. When she looked up, their faces were inches apart. His coat had slipped slightly from his shoulder. Her hands rested against his chest, his heartbeat pounding beneath her fingers. The fire behind them cast an amber glow, painting his cheekbones in gold, catching the silver strands in his hair. Their eyes locked. Neither moved. His hand came up, slowly, as if against his will, and touched a strand of her hair that had fallen loose. He brushed it behind her ear, his fingers grazing the curve of her neck. She inhaled softly, eyes not leaving his. And then, for one suspended, breathless moment, he leaned in. So did she. The space between them vanished until only the echo of a kiss hovered in the air. Never quite taken, never quite given. But he pulled back first, his breath caught, his eyes clouded. He murmured, stepping away. "Forgive me." Lydia did not speak. She only watched him, her heart a storm beneath her ribs. He turned from her, retreating into the shadows of the far room. She stood there, alone in the firelight, the warmth of him still pressed against her skin. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside, something far more dangerous had begun to melt. The storm that morning arrived, not from the sky, but from the trees. Lydia was at the window, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of pine tea, when she saw it. First a flicker of movement between the pines, then a sudden burst of color that did not belong to the snowbound world. A man stumbled from the woods, half bent beneath the weight of a pack, his coat torn and clinging to him like a wet shroud. Blood streaked one leg, and his gait was broken by pain. "Thaddeus!" she called, already setting down the cup, her voice tighter than she intended. By the time Thaddeus emerged from the rear of the cabin, the stranger had collapsed a dozen yards from the porch, his body sinking into the snow like a stone into water. Thaddeus cursed under his breath and ran toward the figure, his boots crunching in the stillness. Lydia followed close behind, heart pounding not just from alarm, but from something else, an unease she could not name. The man was breathing, barely. His skin, though pale with cold, bore the ruddy undertone of someone used to harsher lands. Snow clung to his dark beard, and beneath the brim of his hat, Lydia caught the glint of sharp, intelligent eyes, even in half-consciousness. His coat, once of fine wool, was now threadbare and stained, and when Thaddeus lifted him with care, a flask clattered from inside the stranger's pocket and disappeared into the snow. "Get the door," Thaddeus ordered. Together they carried him inside, laying him near the hearth. Lydia moved instinctively, her hands already reaching for her bundle of cloths and tinctures. She worked in silence, cleaning the gash on his leg, steadying his breath with valerian. The man groaned, his lips parting as though he might speak, but no words came. When she pressed a warm compress to his brow, his lashes fluttered, and then his gaze fixed on her. "Well then," he murmured, his voice hoarse but startlingly clear, "I suppose I've died and gone to heaven." Lydia blinked. Her hand paused. Thaddeus, standing over him with arms crossed, did not smile. "You're not dead," he said. "Not yet." The man chuckled weakly. "A shame. With a face like hers above me, I might have been willing." "Your name?" Thaddeus asked, tone flat. "Ewan," the man said, shifting painfully. "Ewan Blackmore, fur trader, out of Belfast Hollow, but lately from across the lake." He grimaced, glancing at his injured leg. "Got caught between a broken trap and a wolf that didn't want to die." Lydia exchanged a glance with Thaddeus. "Belfast Hollow's 2 days east," Thaddeus said. "What are you doing this far west?" "Trying not to freeze," Ewan replied, then closed his eyes. They let him rest. But the cabin had changed. It took only 1 day for Lydia to notice what Thaddeus already had. Ewan Blackmore was no ordinary trapper. His accent, though mostly buried, held traces of refinement. His clothes, though weathered, were cut from finer cloth than frontier men wore. And his gaze, quick, appraising, rested too long on the small things. The order of her herbs, the lock on Thaddeus's chest, the knife by the door. He was too curious for someone half-healed, and far too charming. By the 3rd day, he sat upright by the fire, eating stew with one hand and toying with a silver ring on his other. He watched Lydia move about the room with a gaze that did not pretend discretion. "Strange place for a lady to be keeping house," he said once, his eyes on her back as she crushed birch bark into powder. "I'm not keeping house," she replied without turning. "I'm surviving." Ewan smiled. "Ah, a woman after my own heart." Thaddeus had not spoken much since Ewan's arrival. He left earlier each morning, returned later each evening, and when he was in the cabin he watched. Ewan, Lydia, the air between them. Something simmered behind his silence. That evening, as Lydia stirred the fire, Ewan leaned closer, his voice low. "You've got Boston hands," he said. She stiffened. "I beg your pardon?" "Your hands, not like trappers' wives. No calluses, fine fingers, and that voice. Educated, no doubt. You weren't born in these woods." She turned to face him, meeting his eyes directly. "Neither were you." He smiled, not sheepishly, but as if she had confirmed something. Later that night, when the hearth had dimmed and the wind pressed against the shutters like a breath held too long, Lydia moved quietly to the back room for more kindling. It was then that she heard them. Ewan's voice, lower, no longer light. "You can play the woodsman all you like, Quinn, but I know your name. Fort Ridge, the tribunal, the dishonor." A pause. Thaddeus's reply was barely audible. "You don't know what happened." "But I know what they said," Ewan continued. "You disobeyed. Let civilians walk free when they weren't meant to. You cost them land, lives. Some say you vanished to avoid the rope." "I saved children," Thaddeus said, his voice like stone. "If that's dishonor, I'll wear it." Lydia's blood ran cold. Ewan chuckled. "So noble. And now you're hiding here, nursing ghosts, with a woman who doesn't belong to you." Silence. Heavy. Threatening. Then Ewan's voice again, soft and sharp. "Her father has gold, you know. enough to make her return worth retrieving. Lydia stepped back, heart hammering. Ewan Blackmore was no wandering trader. He was a shadow sent from the life she had fled, a life lined with brocade and rot. Her father's reach had found her, even here. She returned to the main room and sat in silence. When Thaddeus entered later, his face unreadable, she did not ask. He did not speak. But the firelight flickered between them with new weight. In a cabin meant to hold only two, the presence of a third had ruptured the fragile balance. Secrets once buried had been named, histories once left behind had returned, and Lydia understood, with a clarity that chilled her deeper than any wind, that the past had not remained in Boston. It had followed her, and now it sat beside her, wrapped in charm and lies, waiting to strike. The snow returned with a vengeance, as though nature herself sought to muffle the breath of the earth. It fell in thick, heavy flakes that smothered sound, blurring the lines between day and night. The forest disappeared beneath its weight. The trees bowed in silence, and the air was tinged with the sharpness of wood smoke and warning. Inside the cabin, the fire blazed brighter than usual, but not from comfort. Tension lived in the corners of the room now, tense as a drawn bow, brittle as frost. Ewan Blackmore, half-healed and twice as watchful, lingered too long by the fire and spoke too little with his lips, choosing instead to let his eyes wander and calculate. Lydia felt it with every breath, every glance. He was a question wrapped in civility, and behind his wry smiles and British restraint, something cruel waited. That afternoon, Thaddeus returned from the shed with snow on his shoulders and a decision in his stride. "He's leaving in the morning," he said, setting down his axe without ceremony. His voice was low, firm. Lydia, bent near the hearth tending to crushed lavender and resin, did not look up. "He won't go easily. Then he'll go hard." She raised her gaze slowly. "He threatened you." Thaddeus's eyes darkened, shadows flickering just beneath the surface. "He thinks he knows what I am," he murmured. "But men like him only know what they're told, what they're paid to repeat." Her voice softened. "And what are you, Thaddeus Quinn?" The silence that followed was not hesitation. It was the silence of reckoning. He sat down, his frame heavy with memory. His fingers rested over his knees, thick with calluses, strong enough to build or break. For a long moment he did not speak, but when he did, his voice held no fear, only grief, deep and grave as the earth. "I was a soldier," he said, "honorably sworn, dishonorably broken." Lydia listened, her hands stilled. "There was a village," he continued, "a place we were ordered to raise. They said it was harboring rebels, that there were men hiding among the women. But when we arrived, there were no rifles, only old men, mothers, children." He looked at the fire then, his face carved in light and shadow. "I refused. I said no. My captain carried out the orders without me. When the smoke cleared, only ash remained. They said I defied my oath. They wrote it down as cowardice. A tribunal was held. I was discharged, dishonored. I buried the papers and came here." Lydia rose slowly and crossed the room. She stood before him, close enough that the warmth between their bodies formed a quiet, secret space. "And your wife?" she asked gently. He looked away. "Gone. Fever took her. The baby too. After the war, after the shame, they didn't survive the winter." Lydia knelt, her skirt pooling around her on the wooden floor. She reached for his hand, not forcefully, not pitying, just a touch, steady, present. "You carry it all," she said, "alone, as if you were meant to." "I was meant to," he whispered. "That's the punishment." "No," she said, her voice breaking like ice over moving water. "That's the lie." He looked down at her, and what passed between them then could not be written into any court record or remembered by any man. It was not justice, it was not absolution, it was something older than both, recognition. That night, when Ewan retreated early to the back room, muttering something about his wound and the cold, Lydia stepped outside for air. The snow fell steadily, soft and luminous in the lantern glow. The forest beyond was silver and still. She drew her cloak tighter around her shoulders, but it was not the wind that made her tremble. Behind her, the door creaked. She turned. Thaddeus stood on the threshold, one hand resting against the frame, the other holding the lantern aloft. The light cast a golden halo around him, catching in his hair, warming the lines of his face. "Come in," he said softly, but she didn't move. Not yet. Instead, she turned to face him fully, her breath clouded between them. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Saving them?" His eyes held hers. "Never. Do you regret saving me?" A pause, then a slow step forward, another, until he was near enough that she could feel the heat of his body, even through the cold. "No," he said, "but I regret not knowing how to say it sooner." Her hand lifted, uncertain, and brushed against his coat, near the buttons, near his heart. He closed the distance. Their lips met not with urgency, but with the aching slowness of two people who had spent too long in silence. It was not hunger that drove them, but something quieter, more dangerous. It was the kind of kiss that unknots everything held in place for years. His hand cupped her cheek, rough thumb grazing the corner of her mouth, her fingers threaded into the lapel of his coat, anchoring herself to him as if afraid the snow might swallow them whole. When they pulled apart, breathless, their foreheads rested together, no words, none needed. They returned inside. The fire was low but steady. The cabin was quiet but alert, as if it too had been waiting for this moment. Thaddeus helped her remove her cloak, his fingers brushing her shoulders, her spine. She turned, and they stood face to face in the hush. And then, without a sound, he stepped back. One step, two. His face changed. Something closed behind his eyes, some door slammed by old fears. "I can't," he said hoarsely. Lydia blinked. "Why?" "Because if I hold you," he said, each word weighted, "I won't be able to let you go." A silence opened between them, wide, fragile. She nodded slowly. "All right," she whispered. "Then don't." But he turned from her, retreating to the far end of the room where the shadows lived, where the ghosts still spoke. Lydia stood alone by the fire, its light flickering across her face, her skin flushed with heat and something dangerously close to heartbreak. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft, endless, indifferent. Inside, desire had flared bright enough to burn, and left behind only ash. The storm had quieted, but it had left a silence far heavier than snow. The sky outside was the color of unspoken things, grey, close, thick with cold that refused to lift. Ice coated the branches like glass mourning, and the wind, though gentler now, carried a sharpness that scraped the skin without breaking it. Inside the cabin, warmth still flickered from the hearth, but the air between the three souls who occupied that space had changed. It was no longer the cabin of survival, of closeness born of necessity. Now it was a place of glances withheld, of words chosen too carefully, and of truths pressed beneath the weight of pride and fear. Thaddeus sat at the edge of the table, elbows on his knees, his eyes on the floor, as if it held answers he no longer trusted himself to ask. Lydia moved in silence, gathering herbs and crushed bark into pouches, pretending not to feel the tension rippling just behind her. She no longer touched the edges of the table as she passed, no longer met his gaze for longer than necessary. Her hands moved with precision, but her breath was shallow, her posture careful. Ewan watched them both. He had healed quickly, too quickly perhaps. The wound on his leg had become little more than a limp, and his expression, once masked with politeness, now carried a smugness sharpened by calculation. He sat in the corner with a piece of bread in hand and a gleam in his eye, as though the entire world were a chessboard, and he alone knew where every piece belonged. It was he who broke the silence. "So this is what becomes of honor," he said casually, biting into the crust. "A man with a record darker than the woods he hides in, and a woman who whispers in shadows, hoping not to be found." Thaddeus stiffened. Lydia did not turn. Ewan continued, his voice pleasant, almost amused. "Forgive me, but I've seen enough to draw my conclusions, and conclusions, as you know, travel quickly in the right hands. Thaddeus rose slowly. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. Ewan met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm saying that whatever lies you've built between these walls, they're paper-thin, a single match, and they burn." He turned toward Lydia then, his eyes narrowing. "Does he know, I wonder? What kind of woman runs from lace and status into the arms of a ghost?" Lydia turned at last, her face pale, her voice cold. "I ran from a prison, not into arms. I stand on my own feet." "Do you?" Ewan tilted his head. "Or do you use the pity of broken men to buy your shelter?" Thaddeus stepped forward, fists clenched. "That's enough." Ewan rose to meet him, unafraid. "Is it? Or are you simply angry? Because I've said aloud what you feared since she crossed your threshold." There was a beat of silence, long and brittle. Thaddeus's voice, when it came, was quieter than expected. "She must leave." Lydia stared at him. Her mouth opened, but no sound came, only breath, shallow, disbelieving. "I can't protect her," he continued, eyes not meeting hers. "Not from what's coming, not from the world, not from myself." "You won't," she said, her voice soft but deadly clear. "Not can't. Won't." He said nothing. Ewan's smile returned, slow and poisonous. Lydia turned away. She packed slowly, with hands that no longer trembled, but moved like something inside her had turned to stone. She folded her linen scarf, her shawl, tucked the small jar of valerian root into the pocket of her satchel, tied it with practiced fingers. She wrapped the small portrait of her mother she kept hidden in a leather pouch and slid it beneath the flap. She did not cry. She did not beg. But her breath came shorter with each movement, her skin clammy, her face flushed. She pressed a hand to her brow, but ignored the heat rising beneath her skin. She would walk. She would not look back. She stepped toward the door. The world spun. The satchel slipped from her hand, and then the floor rose to meet her. Thaddeus caught her before she hit the boards. She was burning. He lifted her as he had done once before, weeks earlier, but this time she did not shiver. This time she radiated heat, her skin damp, her breathing shallow. He laid her on the cot, covered her in every blanket he owned, and turned to Ewan with fire in his eyes. "Go," he said. Ewan raised an eyebrow. "She'll die in this cold." "Then it will be on me," Thaddeus replied, "not you." Without another word, Ewan reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope. He placed it on the table beside the basin. "You might want to read that," he said, "before the snow clears." And then he left. The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed. Thaddeus turned back to Lydia. Her eyes were closed, her brow soaked in sweat. Her lips moved faintly, but no words came. He soaked a cloth in cool water and pressed it to her skin. He brewed chamomile and ginger, poured spoonfuls between her lips, coaxing her to drink. All night, he stayed by her side. He did not sleep. He did not speak. But once, when the fire cracked low and the light flickered across her face, he took her hand in both of his, pressed it to his chest and whispered, "I'm sorry. Not for the storm, not for the past, but for breaking her when she had only just begun to heal." Morning came, pale and uncertain. Lydia stirred. Her lips parted. Her eyes, when they opened, were glassy, but they found his. "You stayed," she rasped. His throat tightened. "I never should have sent you away." She tried to smile. It barely formed. He brought the tea to her lips again. "Rest now," he murmured. "You're safe." Outside, the world remained buried in snow, but inside, the fire glowed. And for the first time, Thaddeus Quinn faced not the silence, but the price of it. On the table, the envelope remained unopened, and beside it Lydia's satchel, unpacked, untouched. She had not left, not yet, and he was no longer certain he could let her go. The snow had begun to shift, not loudly, not with grandeur, but in slow, patient whispers. Beneath the heavy white crust that had imprisoned the earth for months, water stirred, quiet rivulets carving paths through frozen ground. weaving among roots and stones like the first breaths of something waking from a long and bitter sleep. The icicles that had gripped the roof now dripped steadily, their tears catching the morning light in glistening rhythm. The cabin, once entombed in frost, seemed to sigh with relief. The air smelled faintly of pine sap, wet bark, and something older, something like renewal. Lydia had not spoken much since the fever broke. She remained wrapped in quilts by the fire, her strength slowly returning in fragments. Her skin, once flushed with illness, now bore only a soft glow of returning color. Her hair had been damp with sweat for days. Now it lay braided gently over one shoulder, chestnut strands catching gold in the firelight. Thaddeus moved around her with quiet precision. He brought her tea, crushed herbs, bowls of broth. But he no longer avoided her gaze. He no longer turned away when she reached for his hand. It was the silence between them that had changed. It no longer weighed. It waited. On the fourth morning since her collapse, Lydia sat upright on the cot. She folded the blanket over her lap and lifted her eyes to meet his. Her voice, though soft, held a steady strength. "You haven't asked me why I came here." Thaddeus paused at the table, a bundle of kindling in his arms. "No," he said. She tilted her head. "Why not?" He set the wood down slowly. "Because I was afraid you'd answer." A quiet beat passed between them. Then she nodded, her lips curving in a small, sad smile. "That's fair." He crossed the room and sat across from her, the low table between them. The light from the window illuminated the hard angles of his face, but his expression was no longer guarded. There was something stripped bare in the way he looked at her now, like a man who had shed the weight of armor he no longer had the strength to carry. "I lost my name," she said simply. "Long before I arrived here." She drew in a breath, her fingers tightening slightly around the rim of her teacup. "I was engaged to a man chosen by my father, a banker, respected, cold. He used me like one might use a locked box, something to own, to silence, to control. When I refused to marry him, my father accused me of hysteria, of weakness. He said no man would want a woman who thought too much, who spoke too clearly." Thaddeus's jaw tightened. "So I left," she continued. "Not to punish anyone, not to prove anything. I left because I was drowning in a house with open windows, and I came north not to be saved, but to remember who I was before I was taught to disappear." Her eyes did not leave his. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I haven't let anyone near," he said, his voice low. "Not since Anna. She was light, all warmth and wild laughter. She made the cabin feel like a home. When she died, I stopped speaking to the world, but not out of loyalty." He paused, shame flickering across his face like smoke. "I did it out of fear, fear that if I loved again, I'd lose again. And if I lost again, I wouldn't survive it." Lydia swallowed hard. "Then why me?" she asked. He met her gaze with quiet intensity. "Because you walked into the fire without flinching," he said, "and I couldn't look away." They sat in stillness, the room around them breathing with memory and confession. The fire snapped softly in the hearth, a single log shifting and settling. Outside, the wind had calmed, the sky a pale shade of blue, not seen since before the new year. Lydia reached across the table and placed her hand over his. It was not a plea, not a demand. Only truth, offered gently, as one might offer a seed to the soil. He turned his hand and wrapped his fingers around hers. And for the first time, there was no wall between them. Only flesh, only warmth, only the knowledge that they had walked alone through darkness, and now sat together at the edge of something new. Later that afternoon, as Lydia rested, Thaddeus stepped outside. The air bit less sharply now, though snow still blanketed the clearing. His boots sank with every step, but beneath the surface he could feel it, the earth softening. The path from the cabin to the trees had thinned. A thin stream of meltwater trickled from the ridge and curved around the firewood stack, disappearing beneath the porch. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath fade into nothing. The door creaked behind him. He turned to see Ewan standing at a distance. saddlebag over one shoulder, coat pulled tight. "I'm leaving," Ewan said, not bothering with pleasantries. "The trail's passable enough now, and I've done what I came to do." Thaddeus crossed his arms. "Did you?" Ewan shrugged. "Your name's no longer useful. Hers, however, remains valuable." Thaddeus said nothing. Ewan stepped closer and lowered his voice. "I sent my report 2 days ago, but don't worry. I didn't tell them everything." "Why?" Ewan's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time, there was something almost human behind them. "Because even I know what it looks like when two people are trying to rebuild from ash, and perhaps that's worth more than coin." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "Something came from Portland," he said, handing it over. "Didn't read it. Not my place." He turned without waiting for a response. By the time Thaddeus unfolded the letter, Ewan was halfway down the trail, his figure blurring into the trees. The seal bore the mark of the military office in Portland. The letter invited Thaddeus Quinn, former officer of the North Company, to appear before a formal inquiry to appeal his discharge. It stated that several testimonies had surfaced concerning the incident at Fort Ridge, that if he wished, he might reclaim his name. He folded the letter and stared toward the woods. The world, it seemed, was beginning to stir, and so was he. That night, he sat by Lydia's side once more. She was sleeping, her brow smooth, her breath even. He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek and whispered, not to wake her, but so that she might carry the words into her dreams. "You were never a burden." He sat there long after the fire burned low. Outside, the snow melted in quiet streams. Inside, redemption had begun to take root. The thaw had grown bold. What once whispered now sang. Meltwater rushed down the hills in silver streams, carving new paths through the snowbanks and soaking the edges of the cabin porch. The earth, long hidden beneath layers of ice, emerged rich and dark as spilled ink. Birds, tentative at first, returned to the branches with flutters and songs that broke the winter's long silence. Inside the cabin, windows were open for the first time in months. The scent of damp pine, wet soil, and something sweet, wild sap or early moss, drifted through the air. Lydia stood by the small table, grinding mint leaves into a poultice. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, her hair braided and pinned up, and her cheeks were flushed with quiet concentration. Across from her, Thaddeus mended a fishing net, his fingers rough but careful. The light from the open door warmed the side of his face, and his expression was peaceful, watchful. He had not spoken of the letter from Portland since the day he read it, but it had not left his pocket since. It was just past midday when the sound of hooves broke the stillness. Lydia froze. Thaddeus looked up sharply. His hand went to the blade hanging from the peg beside the door, not in fear, but in readiness. A moment later, a figure on horseback emerged through the trees, trailing dust and melting frost. The man was dressed in city riding clothes, travel-worn but fine, and carried a small satchel bound in polished leather. The horse halted before the porch. The rider dismounted stiffly, tipping his hat. "Mr. Quinn?" he asked, eyes scanning the cabin. Thaddeus stepped into the doorway but did not speak. The man cleared his throat and withdrew 2 envelopes from his satchel. "One for you," he said, offering the one with the seal of Portland, "and one for Miss Lydia Marlowe, by order of her father, Nathaniel Marlowe of Boston." Lydia stepped into view before Thaddeus could respond. "I am Miss Marlowe," she said evenly. The man blinked. I was told you were ill, possibly unwell. This letter is accompanied by an affidavit regarding your mental state. Your father claims—" "My father has never known my mind," Lydia interrupted, her voice steady, her gaze unflinching. "Only the weight of it when it did not bend to his will." The courier hesitated, then handed her the envelope without further comment. Thaddeus remained silent, but his eyes never left her. Inside, Lydia broke the seal. The paper was thick and expensive. The ink bled slightly, as if the words themselves were embarrassed to exist. She read quickly, her hands steady despite the heat building at the base of her spine. The letter was short. Her father's solicitor claimed that Lydia had suffered a nervous collapse and fled the city in a state of confusion. It detailed a request for her return under humane custodial observation and stated that local authorities had been informed. There were legal threats, quiet insinuations, and a veiled promise that should she be returned promptly, no permanent record would be filed. Lydia folded the letter and set it down on the table with deliberate care. She turned to Thaddeus. "May I see yours?" He handed her the letter from Portland. She read it twice, then looked at him, not with surprise, but with something deeper, something like understanding, something like awe. "They're giving you the chance to clear your name," she said softly. He nodded once. "They've opened an inquiry, a chance to speak, officially." Her voice dropped. "Will you go?" "I will," he said. She studied him. "Alone?" He stepped closer, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the warmth of him, smell the wood smoke in his coat, the pine in his skin. "No," he said quietly. "Not this time." Her breath caught. "I don't want to be a shadow anymore," he continued. "Not a ghost hiding in these woods, not a man known only by whispers and silence. I want to stand beside someone who knows me, all of me." He reached for her hand and brought it to his chest. "I want to stand beside you, not hidden, not in exile, not waiting to be worthy." Lydia's heart ached with the weight of everything he was giving her. His voice, his name, his shame, and his hope. Not as confession, as offering. She looked down at the letter from her father. It lay limp on the table like a shed skin. "All my life," she whispered, "I have been told to lower my voice, to soften my thoughts, to be grateful for a cage lined in lace. And now I am told I am mad for choosing silence over obedience, for choosing to breathe." She looked up at him, her eyes burning. "But I am not mad. I am awake." Thaddeus's thumb brushed the edge of her jaw. His voice, when it came, was full of reverence. "I know." Outside, the courier cleared his throat softly. Lydia stepped past Thaddeus and handed him her letter. "Tell my father I am not returning," she said. "Tell him I am not his to command, not his to retrieve. And if he sends anyone else, I will not be as gentle." The man, clearly unaccustomed to women who wielded their voices like blades, nodded hastily and returned to his horse. They watched him disappear into the trees. Later, as dusk fell, Lydia and Thaddeus stood on the porch in silence. The wind stirred the bare branches, and somewhere in the distance a thawed stream gurgled with life. "Do you think he'll come for me?" she asked at last. Thaddeus didn't answer immediately. "I think he already lost you the day he tried to claim you." She leaned against him then, her head against his shoulder, his arm folding around her like a promise. That night, they sat together in the warmth of the hearth. Lydia opened her worn leather notebook and began sketching the layout of a small shop. A table for tinctures, a cabinet for oils, shelves for dried herbs. Thaddeus read the letter from Portland again, this time with steadier hands. Neither asked what the next season would bring. They had made their choices together. And just outside the door, beneath the last crusts of snow, the earth waited to bloom. The woods had changed their skin. Where once the trees stood like mourners in white, they now danced beneath the weight of their own green joy. Leaves fluttered like silken ribbons in the breeze, and wildflowers embroidered the forest floor with color. The river, once strangled by ice, now hummed with movement, its waters glass clear and fast, threading between stones with purpose. The cabin, too, had changed, not in structure, but in soul. The door no longer creaked from disuse, but swung wide to welcome wind and sun. A vine of jasmine climbed eagerly up the porch rail, its pale blooms releasing their fragrance with every warm breath of air. The shutters were painted soft sage green, and inside, the light moved as if it belonged. In the garden just beyond the cabin's side, Lydia knelt among rows of growing things. Her hands were deep in the soil, dirt streaked across her apron, and a faint smudge on her cheek. Her wide-brimmed straw hat cast dappled shadows over her face, but her eyes were alight. watchful, patient, certain. Beside her, tall stalks of calendula reached for the sun, while valerian and comfrey clustered near the cabin wall. A wooden drying rack hung with strips of muslin fluttered under the porch awning, carrying the faint scents of rosemary and mint. Tiny glass jars lined a shelf beneath the eaves, tinctures, infusions, fragments of healing captured by her own hands. She stood slowly, brushing the dust from her skirt, and looked toward the path that led to the stream. A figure appeared between the trees, familiar even from a distance. Thaddeus carried a bundle of firewood under one arm and a basket of river stones in the other. His shirt was damp at the collar, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his face shaded by the brim of a straw hat that did little to conceal the sun-browned angles of his jaw. He paused at the edge of the clearing, his eyes finding hers with the ease of one who no longer needed permission to look. He smiled, and it was not the hesitant smile of winter, but the smile of a man returned to himself. Lydia smiled back. They met near the porch, and as he set the basket down, she touched his arm, not to steady herself, but to anchor him in that moment. "How was the river?" she asked. "Generous," he replied, pulling a small cloth parcel from his pocket. "I found this for you." She unfolded it to find a stone, smooth and oval, its color soft lavender gray. A natural vein of white traced its center like a scar healed long ago. "It reminded me of your voice," he said. "Quiet, but impossible to ignore." She looked up, struck by the way his gaze held no apology now, only presence. "I'll keep it on my table," she said. That evening, they sat on the porch with 2 steaming cups between them, the sky awash in orange and rose. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the garden. Bees wandered lazily between petals, and the wind teased the jasmine leaves, sending their perfume drifting. Inside, the apothecary shelves were now full, jars neatly labeled in Lydia's careful script, oils glistening like amber, rows of drying stems tied with ribboned twine. The cabin had grown wider without expanding. It had become a place of rhythm, of seasons, of return. Thaddeus brought out a book, its cover worn, its spine lovingly mended. She recognized it at once. "My old text," she said, surprised, "from the Boston apothecary." "I found it in the bottom of your satchel," he said. "You never noticed I repaired it." She laughed, soft and warm. "I suppose I was busy not dying." He opened the book and flipped to a bookmarked page. Clearing his throat, he began to read aloud, his voice low and steady. "There are wounds which no blade inflicts, wounds made by silence, by absence, by the closing of a door that should have stayed open. These wounds leave no scar, but demand healing all the same." He paused. Lydia looked at him, her eyes shimmering. "I underlined that," she said quietly. "Years ago." "I know," he replied. The ink bled through the page. She reached across the book and touched his hand. It was a simple touch, their fingers resting side by side, their palms not yet joined. But the weight of it, the stillness it carried, held more certainty than any embrace. They did not need to speak of the tribunal, of Portland, of the letter cleared, the record amended. Nor did they speak of Boston, or the notice that had gone unanswered, or the absence of carriages along the road. They had chosen, not in haste, not in desperation, but in clarity. That night, Lydia stood barefoot in the garden beneath a sky jeweled with stars. The wind was soft against her skin, and the earth was warm beneath her toes. Thaddeus came behind her, wrapping a shawl gently over her shoulders. He said nothing, only slipped his hand into hers, their fingers fitting with the ease of something long known. "You were never a ghost," she whispered. "You just forgot you had a body. And you," he said, pressing his forehead to her temple, "were never mad. Only too vivid for men who feared color in their world of gray." They stood in silence, not to escape words, but because no words were needed. When they returned to the cabin, Lydia paused at the door and looked back at the garden. Jasmine blossoms caught the moonlight like small lanterns, swaying in rhythm with the trees. "The snow tried to bury us," she said. Thaddeus nodded. "But it didn't know what we were made of." She took his hand again, and together they crossed the threshold, not into exile, but into the life they had made, the one they had chosen, and inside, the fire glowed. The pages turned, and what had once been silence was now home. The trees were on fire again, not with flame but with color, gold, crimson and copper, trembling in the breeze like a last exhale before winter's return. The forest, once a place of exile and secrets, now hummed with life. Children's laughter echoed faintly down the trail, followed by the uneven rhythm of small boots against soft earth and the occasional scolding from a firm, patient voice. The cabin still stood, though time had softened its edges. The roof had been mended twice. A new chimney had been built of hand-carved stone. The porch had expanded to hold a bench, a table for drying herbs, and a small wooden swing that creaked gently in the wind. A pair of shoes, too small for a man, too worn for a child, rested by the door. Inside, the apothecary shelves stretched wider now, filled with years of labor, discovery, and healing. Jars labeled in Lydia's neat hand lined the walls, some dated back nearly a decade, others marked from last month's gathering. The scent of lavender and myrrh clung to the air, mixed with the sharper notes of vinegar and camphor. Lydia stood by the window, her hair streaked now with silver, but still thick, still pinned with the same quiet grace. Her hands, always steady, were rinsing dried petals into a linen sachet. She paused often to listen, to the wind, to the laughter outside, to the footfalls she had memorized long ago. Thaddeus entered through the rear door, carrying a basket of apples, the hem of his coat dusted with leaves. His beard was flecked with grey, and a slight limp followed him on colder days, but his eyes, those watchful hazel eyes, remained unchanged. "You left them alone by the creek?" Lydia asked, turning with a raised brow. "They're not alone," he said with a smile. "They have each other, and Gideon's got that whistle you carved. He's louder than any bear." She took the basket from him, brushing her hand along his wrist as she did. He didn't let go immediately. "How is your back?" she asked softly. "Stubborn," he said, "like its owner." Lydia shook her head and kissed his cheek, letting her lips linger just a moment longer. Outside, footsteps approached. 3 children burst into the cabin with red cheeks and wind-tangled hair. Gideon, age 7, held a stick like a sword and a mud-stained whistle between his teeth. Annalise, age 5, cradled a jar of frog spawn with scientific pride. The youngest, Clara, barely 3, ran straight to Thaddeus with arms open wide. He lifted her easily, despite the protest in his joints. Lydia watched them all with a quiet, luminous pride. 8 years had passed since the winter that changed everything. 8 years since Lydia had chosen the woods over Boston, truth over silence, a life of risk over a life of gilded cages. She had never returned. Neither had her father's letters. Thaddeus, after the Portland inquiry, had declined any formal reinstatement. He gave no speeches, refused medals. He only asked that the record reflect the truth. It did. Ewan Blackmore had vanished into the northern roots after the thaw. Rumors drifted in from time to time, of a trader silenced by debts, of a man whose silver tongue finally turned on him. No one came asking for Lydia again, but travelers came for other reasons. Word of the apothecary had spread, not widely but enough. Women came quietly, some bruised, some afraid. Others came seeking knowledge, not cure. Lydia taught them. Slowly, carefully. She did not call herself a healer, but she became one. And Thaddeus? He became what he was never allowed to be before, a man at peace. He built furniture. He taught Gideon to fish. He read aloud in the evenings, sometimes from Lydia's old apothecary texts, sometimes from novels borrowed from passing missionaries. His voice had found its rhythm again, and Lydia often thought it was her favorite sound in the world. They did not live without sorrow. They buried one child before she had even taken her first breath. They spent 2 winters nursing fevered villagers in silence and fear. They argued sometimes, Lydia's sharp tongue meeting Thaddeus's iron will, but always came back to the hearth, to the garden, to the space between their hands where everything had first begun. One evening, near the end of October, they sat together on the porch as leaves fell like ashes and the children dozed against a blanket nearby. Thaddeus held a worn book in his lap. Lydia rested her head against his shoulder. He opened to a familiar page. "Read it," she murmured. He did. "There are wounds which no blade inflicts. Wounds made by silence, by absence, by the closing of a door that should have stayed open. These wounds leave no scar, but demand healing all the same." When he closed the book, Lydia turned her face toward him. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. Thaddeus looked at her, the woman who had walked into his solitude, broken through his winter and made a life bloom in its place. "Only that we didn't have more time sooner," he said. "But no, never this, never us." She smiled, slow and deep. The wind rustled the jasmine vine, now older, heavier, still blooming late into the season. The snow would come again, but this time they would not meet it as strangers or exiles. They would face it as they always had, together. And whatever the world forgot, the forest would remember, the cabin would remember. Their love born beneath the snow would remember, because some stories do not fade, they grow. There are stories that warm us like a fire in winter, and the cabin in the thaw is one of them. Lydia and Thaddeus taught us that healing does not always come through time. It comes through truth, through daring to choose a different life, even when the world calls you mad for wanting more. Through standing tall in your silence, and finally, through letting someone love you exactly as you are. This is not just a love story. It's a story about choosing love, about breaking generational chains, about the courage it takes to begin again, even in the coldest of seasons. If this story touched you, if it made you ache or smile or simply pause, we invite you to tell us in the comments what part stayed with you most. And if you've made it all the way here to the end, write the word Jasmine in the comments. That way we'll know you stayed until the very last bloom, and we'll smile when we see your name. If you feel moved to support the team that brings these stories to life, you're welcome to send a super thanks in any amount that feels right for you. Every contribution helps us keep creating timeless tales for this beautiful community. And if that's not possible right now, don't worry. Your presence is already a gift. You can also help by sharing this video with someone you think would fall in love with this story too. And if you're still craving more heartfelt historical romances, we've left some hand-picked stories for you in the cards above. We think you'll fall for those characters just as deeply. Thank you, from the bottom of our hearts, for watching, for feeling, for staying. We'll see you in the next story.